now that we've looked at essentially the Prussian road to capitalism in the U.S. South, we're going to move in time. Well, I guess it's in time and also place, and look at a very different road to capitalism. And we're going to look at the example of South Africa. And South Africa, what's interesting is that in this particular case, we're really looking at the state as the prime mover of this transition to capitalism. So to better explain this transition is I'm here with Professor Rick Halpern, and he's going to talk about more in depth that transition. I'll ask him a few questions. He's going to basically, what we'll do is we'll contextualize a little bit of European settlement, look at these sort of revolutions in South Africa, what industries emerge, particularly in the mining industry, and then we'll look at how the state rationalizes the economy as it moves into the 20th century, and you end up eventually with a apartheid state that most of us are at least partially familiar with in the South African case. I think what we'll start with maybe is if you could just contextualize the initial European settlement of the southern tip of Africa.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Will. I know that in History A09, you've looked at the state and imperial expansion in the first third of the course. And I know that you've also looked at the importance of long distance trade for the development of capitalism. And European settlement on the southern tip of Africa comes right out of those joint stock companies that we've looked at in this course. In this case, it's the Dutch and something called the Dutch East India Company. Now, the main colony was not in Africa. It was in the Far East, what's now Indonesia. The colony of Batavia provided the kinds of spices and exotic cloth that you've looked at when we've looked at overland trade to Asia. The settlement at Cape Town, or what becomes Cape Town, was really a minor part of this far-flung Dutch trading empire. It was a resupply and layover port for ships that were heading much farther east. Yet a colony did develop, run very, very strictly by the Dutch East India Company, which almost was a state unto itself. But in terms of economic activity, this is not a major player either in the Dutch world of trade, and certainly not in early capitalism. The British come into play at the very end of the 18th century, and they come into conflict with the Dutch.
Rick, for giving that sort of background into the settlement of South Africa, particularly starting with the Dutch and then the British. But you mentioned at the end that initially that the British and the Dutch didn't have a lot of contact, but then eventually there was this conflict that emerges between them. Is that conflict relevant to the transition to capitalism? And could you say a little bit more about that?
Thanks. It's a really good question. And I think it is highly relevant both to the story that's unfolding about capitalist revolution in Southern Africa, but also in terms of History A09. I know that last week in this course, you looked at the persistence of unfree labor, and you spent some time talking about the various systems that replace slavery around the world, but particularly within the British Empire. Well, in Southern Africa, where the British and the Dutch settlers come into conflict, is over Dutch labor relations. The Dutch began to use native peoples as slaves, as clients, as very underpaid laborers. And as humanitarianism within the British Empire began to ramp up, and there began to be quite a bit of anti-slavery agitation back in London, British authorities at the Cape began to interfere with the more harsh and exploitative aspects of Dutch labor relations. And there's a point at which things become so tense between the two groups of settlers that the Dutch, now identifying themselves as Boers and speaking a completely different language, Afrikaans, decide to pick up and retreat into the interior to be able to continue their pastoral agriculture, their cattle raising, their subsistence farming out of the way of interfering British authorities. What you see here are the two Boer republics that result from this trek known as the Great Trek into the interior. This occurs in the later part of the 1830s. And although this map is from 1885, you clearly see the Orange Free State right there in the center. And right above it, you see the second Boer Republic, known as the South African Republic. And I think it's fair to say that Boers and Britons pursue very independent existences after the trek. And the Cape Colony for Britain remains a minor colony, just as it was very minor for the Dutch in the age of the primacy of their empire. But all of this begins to change towards the end of the 19th century, when there is the discovery of gold in the area around current-day Johannesburg. That's the circle up above. Yep. And diamonds in the area between the Orange Free State and Griqualand West, the town of Kimberley.
Thanks for that. So that just contextualizes this conflict that emerges between the British settlers and particularly the British imperial state and its meddling in these kind of Dutch labor laws. But how does the emergence of the mining industry, particularly in gold and diamonds, what is the significance of that in its transition to this capitalist economy that starts to emerge in the 20th century? If you could speak a bit more on that.
Certainly, yeah. And again, it's a very good question. So Southern Africa, which had been at best a minor concern of the expanding British Empire, with the discovery of gold in particular, but also diamonds, Southern Africa blooms very, very large in the imperial imaginary, but also very, very large in terms of the world capitalist economy. This gold discovery quickly is understood as the most important discovery of gold ever, far dwarfing, say, the 1849 discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California, or the Yukon gold rush that follows. But there's real challenges for British mining companies that want to get this gold out of the ground and turn it into gold bullion.
It's interesting in this case, because I am familiar a little bit more with the California gold rush, having studied it. And I mean, that gold rush was interesting in the sense that it was a lot of these settlers that just moved out to California to strike it rich. But it sounds like what happens here is quite a bit different, particularly because you have the conflict between the Boers and the British, but also a much larger kind of imperial state, maybe. If you could speak a bit more about how mining looked different in this context than, say, the standard, gold rush pioneers and common man goes out to strike it rich.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So if you want to imagine the California gold rush for a moment, imagine that almost anybody who can get across the United States and has enough money for a mule and a pickaxe and a pan can wade into a stream and begin prospecting for gold. And in fact, when we look at the California gold rush or the Yukon rush that follows, these are tiny proprietors who are able to flourish by staking out very small claims that can be worked by one person or 1 to 5 people, at least in the early stages. In Southern Africa, it's a very, very different situation. Although there are some fortune seekers early on, it quickly becomes apparent that most of this gold is deep, deep, deep under the ground. And once it becomes obvious that a very primitive sort of surface mining, a kind of precursor to strip mining, isn't really going to work, it requires enormous capitalization to dig shafts that go tens of thousands of meters, kilometers really, under the ground. It's well beyond the reach of an individual. There's another problem as well. Although, as I've said, the gold reserves under the ground were extensive, the ore was very, very poor quality, and it very often was alloyed with other impurities and other minerals. So once you got the gold up to the surface, you then had to smelt the gold to separate the gold itself from the other alloy, the other minerals and metals that it was amalgamated with. And this also required a significant amount of money. So by the turn of the 19th century, two important things happen. One is the British fight a war with the Boers, sometimes called the South African War, sometimes called the Boer War. And the real purpose of this conflict was to secure untrammeled British access and control over the mineral resources at the southern tip of the continent. But the other thing that it did is it opened the way for British capital to move into Southern Africa, where heretofore it had very little interest. And probably the most well-known landlord who moved into the area was Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodes Scholarship is named after him. And it was Rhodes who, along with a few other entrepreneurs, but highly, highly capitalized businessmen, move into South Africa, develop what becomes Johannesburg, and set up a remarkable, capital-intensive mining complex in the ring of natural rock that surrounded the city.
Right. So it seems then that the discovery of gold and diamonds and raw materials is, as you said, starts plugging South Africa into a much, or at least more intensely plugs into this capitalist economy or global capitalist economy, as opposed to just this stopping off point for more important colonies on the other side of the Indian Ocean, perhaps. And now with this mining, because what's interesting is how you mentioned how it is very different than the California case, right? And it does create conflict amongst the British and the Dutch Boers, largely because there's lots of money to be made. People like Cecil Rhodes move in. But what is the labor system that then emerges? If it's not pioneers, as you put it, sifting for gold in the streams and, this kind of mythical land of plenty in California, if it does require all this kind of capital intensive investments from, say, the Imperial Center in London, and these mines are really, really deep, what kind of labor system then emerges under that type of mining operation?
Well, again, Will, thanks for that question, because I think the answer to it gets right to the heart of why the South African case is so important for our understanding of alternative paths to capitalism. I think it really is all contained within what we might call the labor question or the labor problem in Southern Africa. Because the gold is so hard to get at, because it's so difficult and costly to refine, the difference between operating this mining complex, the RAND, profitably and being unable to turn a profit and accumulate additional capital all comes down to cheap labor. Now, South Africa, at the time of union in 1910, well after the Boer War, all of those colonies are combined to create the Union of South Africa. At that time, the vast majority of the population, well over 90% of the entire population, are Africans. The white population is divided between those who speak English and can trace their heritage to the British Isles. They clearly have the upper hand after the Boer War, and the Afrikaans-speaking Boers, the descendants of the Dutch. And it is those Africans who are brought into a capitalist economy and provide the cheap labor that allows fortunes to be made, massive amounts of capital to accumulate and then flow to other parts of the empire, including other parts of British Africa. And it's the British imperial state that intervenes in many ways, in unprecedented fashion, to fashion a political economy in South Africa that both provides cheap labor, institutes segregation, and puts the country on the road to apartheid.
What I think I wanted to center on now is you mentioned toward the end of it how these mining operations bring in the 90%, over 90% of the population that are, of course, indigenous Africans. You said they kind of bring them into the capitalist economy. And my understanding in the South African case, that was the indigenous peoples were essentially attached to the land in ways that, say, the labor system in the American South, slaves weren't, because that system was broken through their bondage to their master. But in this particular case, there is this sense that they are attached to the land. So how is it that the British lure them into this capitalist economy, whether through incentivization or outright coercion?
I think you make an excellent point about the attachment of most Africans to the land. In fact, I think it's fair to say that well into the 20th century, Africans persist with connection to the land, and some scholars have even talked about the endurance of an African mode of production. What this means is British capital, or in this case, the imperial state, needs to develop a number of coercive mechanisms that compel certain Africans, in this case, young men, late teenagers, men in their 20s, off the land and into mining and into a waged economy. And the first important step in this direction comes shortly after Union, which was in 1910. In 1913, there's the passage of a Natives Lands Act. And the Land Act really dispossesses many Africans from traditional lands and concentrated them in a form of territorial segregation into a small minority of the land in South Africa. And if we could go to the map that we have, this is very, I think, clearly and dramatically illustrated, because what you see in black here are the official lands reserved for Africans, and what you see in white is the vast majority of land in South Africa. Now, not all of it is arable, but the important point is that most land, including areas where commercial agriculture had begun to develop, and certainly including those areas where minerals were being extracted, are now reserved for whites. So the 1913 Native Lands Act is then coupled with a number of other interventions on the part of the British imperial state that move to create a system of long-distance labor migration. And the most important aspect of this system is something called the hut tax. And the hut tax is a tax on every single dwelling in an African village or community. And in order to raise the money to pay this hut tax, communities, and in reality, the chiefs and the power of African chiefdoms is shored up by the imperial state. They send young men out to work for a period of time on the Rand, in gold mines, in Kimberley, and the diamond mines. And when those young men return seasonally to their homestead, the term in Afrikaans is kraal, when they return to the homestead, some of their wages then are handed over so the hut tax can be paid. There are other aspects that are coercive as well. One of the more important ones is pass laws. Africans are not allowed to move to Johannesburg or move to Pretoria or move to Cape Town. They're meant to stay in these areas that have been set aside for them. And if they're to be on the roads or to be on the trains, they need to have passes. And the British state enforces this. So there is an element where police force is used to enforce pass laws.
That was really interesting, just looking at the ways that this labor system evolves, and how what I find really fascinating about it when we look at these alternative roads to capitalism is how the primary source of labor kind of has a dual quality to it. And it reminded me of the American South, that of course we just talked about prior to this video, in the sense that sharecroppers kind of had one foot in the market, where they were producing, say, tobacco for, it's like staple crop production, just like the plantation economy had been doing for a long time. But at the same time, when it came to their own personal consumption, were largely living a subsistence lifestyle. Do we see similarities in South Africa? And could you also talk about the kind of theoretical implications of that in terms of our course, and how different places end up in a capitalist mode of production?
I think the comparison with the American South after the Civil War is an excellent one. And in fact, there is a quite sustained scholarly literature on this. The notion of a dual economy is really important here, and it characterizes both the American South and South Africa in the period we're now looking at. As you've pointed out, in large parts of the tobacco South, the cotton South, sharecroppers clearly are producing a staple that's sold on the world market, whether it be tobacco or cotton or indigo or what have you. Yet if we look at the actual existence, day-to-day existence, the social relations of sharecropping, they're not a part of a market economy. Many of these families could go years without seeing money, without seeing wages. The way they were supplied with the necessities of life was very different than purchasing those things in an open market. Well, in South Africa, we also see a dual economy. Let's use the example that we've just been talking about of long distance labor migration to the gold mines of the Rand. For 7 or 8 months, a young man is really at the center of a capitalist economy, providing gold for the world's most dynamic and dominant imperial power, Britain. But when that young man goes back home, he enters a very, very different economy, one where his family still has attachment to the land and is growing foodstuffs for sustenance. And in a theoretical sense, I think there are 2 points to be made. These two spheres, whether we're looking at the US South or we're looking at South Africa, they're not existing independently or in an autonomous way from each other, far from it. They're actually mutually constitutive. They support each other, and we can call this the articulation of 2 different modes of production. Let me explain what I mean a little more fully by looking at the South African case. One of the reasons that cheap labor is so cheap has little to do with the notion of debased wages that are being paid Africans. Rather, it has everything to do with the fact that the cost of the reproduction of labor, the social reproduction of labor, is not taking place on the mines. It's not taking place outside of those homesteads, but rather it's being borne by those communities, largely by women in those communities, because with so many men away, it's the women who are tending the fields. It's the women who are raising the children. It's the women who are preparing for the return of their menfolk who are migrant laborers. The cost of the reproduction of labor is borne by this other section of the economy. And that's what allows extractive industry to continue to function so profitably, because it's helping drive down the cost of labor.
Well, interesting. And that interestingly brings up, I think, a point I made in the last lecture, which is, I think, that Rosa Luxemburg point, where in certain modes, often capitalism relies on a non-capitalist form of production. And I guess this is a perfect example that illustrates you have this dynamic capitalist world economy that is dependent on this, as you said, one of the most important gold reserves in the world at the time. And yet so much of the cost of reproducing that labor exists in a non-capitalist mode of production. And so that they're kind of dependent on creating that dual thing. Last question I had was, if you could speak to this, when we talked about the Southern road to capitalism, and it was in the readings where Jonathan Weiner talks about this Prussian road, right? This theoretical Prussian road. If the South takes a Prussian road to capitalism, in the case of South Africa, could you characterize it as a kind of imperial road to capitalism? Or is that oversimplifying it?
I think it simplifies it, but it simplifies it in a way that makes a very powerful point. The key actor here is the British imperial state. There's no getting around that. And we began our discussion by pointing out that this sets South Africa on a road or a path that takes them to segregation and ultimately to apartheid. And, you know, when scholars first began looking and trying to understand this very harsh system of race relations that characterized mid and late 20th century South Africa, they assumed that this all came from the Dutch. It really was a legacy of the Dutch East India Company and a legacy of the relations between Boers and natives. Scholarship really has moved well away from that and has come to a consensus that it really is the British imperial state and its need to mobilize and to manage cheap labor that leads to segregation and then lays the groundwork for apartheid, even though apartheid is a system that's presided over by an Afrikaans political project, the National Party that comes to power in the late 1940s.